This is breaking news unfolding right now in one of the most dangerous waterways on the face of this planet. What I'm about to tell you is not speculation. It is not rumor. It is happening as we speak in the Strait of Hormuz, and the consequences of what just took place there are reverberating through every government, every military command center, every intelligence agency, and every energy trading floor on Earth at this very moment. A Chinese tanker just attempted to run straight through an American naval blockade, and what happened in the minutes that followed sent a message so loud, so clear, and so devastating that it is forcing the entire world to recalculate everything it thought it knew about the balance of power in the 21st century. I am going to walk you through every single detail of what happened, why it matters far more than anyone is telling you, and what comes next, because this story is not about one ship. It is not about one waterway. It is about the future of global power itself. And if this is the kind of deep, honest, no-nonsense coverage you want, the kind you will not find on mainstream networks, then hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications because things are moving fast and you do not want to miss what comes next. Let me take you to the moment that changed everything. A tanker named Rich Star was sitting 20 minutes away from the United States Navy's enforcement corridor in the Strait of Hormuz. There was no warning transmission, there was no radio communication, there was no formal request for permission to pass. The vessel simply adjusted its heading, increased its speed, and drove directly toward the American blockade line as if it simply did not exist. Think about that for a moment. A commercial vessel linked to the Chinese supply chain making a deliberate run at the most powerful naval force ever assembled in that waterway. On the bridge of an American warship monitoring the corridor, every single screen lit up simultaneously. Every sensor, every tracking system, every alert protocol activated at once. And within 20 minutes, that tanker executed a complete U-turn. It did not slow down and negotiate. It did not hold position and wait. It turned around, and it was not alone. Two more Chinese-linked tankers, the Austria and at least one other vessel, repeated the exact same maneuver in rapid succession. 3 tankers, 3 U-turns, no shots fired, no standoff, no dramatic confrontation, just a turn, a retreat, and a message received loud and clear by every power watching. Now here is the critical part that nobody in mainstream media is telling you. The tanker turning back was not the most important thing that happened in that moment. The most important thing, the thing that has intelligence analysts in Washington, London, and Tokyo writing urgent classified assessments right now, is what that U-turn exposed. What it revealed about a confrontation that has been quietly, methodically, and deliberately building for years beneath the surface of trade agreements, diplomatic handshakes, summit photos, and carefully worded communiques coming out of Beijing. For the first time in decades, the gap between what China publicly claims it can do and what China can actually do when tested in the real world was ripped wide open, in public, in real time, on the most strategically important and most closely watched waterway on the entire planet. And the implications of that exposure go so far beyond a single tanker making a U-turn that it will take years for the full consequences to play out. Stay with me on this because what is unfolding in the Strait of Hormuz right now is not just a story about Iranian oil. It is not just a story about American military power. It is the story of the real, measurable, undeniable limits of Chinese power being tested and found wanting at the worst possible moment for Beijing. And the entire world is now watching to see exactly where those limits end. To truly understand why a tanker turning around in a shipping lane carries this much weight, you need to understand what was carefully and painstakingly built between Beijing and Tehran over the past 15 years. Because the American blockade did not just stop Iranian oil from leaving port, it severed a strategic relationship that both countries had invested enormous resources into constructing, a relationship that China had quietly come to depend on in ways that go far, far beyond the price of a barrel of crude oil. China is Iran's largest trading partner. It is by far Iran's most important oil customer. But this relationship was never just about buying and selling petroleum. Iran gave China something invaluable: direct access to Middle Eastern geography through belt and road infrastructure investments. Most critically, Iran provided access through the port of Chabahar, which offered Beijing a transit point that completely bypassed traditional American-controlled and American-influenced trade routes. This was not a minor logistical convenience. This was a strategic corridor that allowed Chinese goods and influence to flow into the Middle East and Central Asia through a door that Washington could not easily shut. In exchange, China gave Iran something equally critical to its survival: technology, infrastructure development, diplomatic cover in international forums where Iran faced isolation, and perhaps most importantly of all, China provided a shadow fleet of tankers that moved Iranian crude oil to Chinese refineries in open defiance of Western sanctions. This shadow fleet kept the Islamic Republic economically functional, kept its government solvent, kept its population fed through years of maximum pressure campaigns that would otherwise have strangled the Iranian economy to the point of collapse. Together, these two nations built an entire system, a pipeline of oil, money, technology, and strategic protection flowing in both directions, a system that operated largely outside the frameworks that Washington controlled. Iran needed Chinese demand to survive economically. China needed Iranian oil to stay cheap and its Middle Eastern foothold to stay relevant geopolitically. It was a partnership of mutual necessity, and both sides knew it. And then, on April 13, 2026, the United States Navy shut the entire system down in a single morning. Karg Island, the absolute heart of Iran's oil export infrastructure, through which roughly 90% of all Iranian crude oil flows, was locked down completely. Chabahar, the port China had spent years and billions cultivating as its alternative gateway into the region, the gateway that was supposed to bypass Hormuz, locked. Bandar Abbas, the primary entry and exit point for virtually everything moving in and out of Iran by sea, locked. Every single channel through which Beijing had been purchasing discounted, sanctioned Iranian oil was sealed simultaneously. The Belt and Roads Iranian leg, an infrastructure investment representing billions of Chinese dollars and years of strategic planning, became operationally useless overnight. Stranded. The diplomatic shield that Beijing had carefully constructed around Tehran through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was rendered completely irrelevant because the problem was no longer being addressed through diplomacy or votes or resolutions. It was being solved through 3 carrier strike groups, 15 warships, continuous fighter jet patrols in the sky, and submarine coverage beneath the surface that China had absolutely no capability to contest in that geography. 190 million barrels of Iranian oil, loaded, ready for export, stranded at sea with nowhere to go. The strategic bridge that took over a decade to build was cut in a single morning. But even that was not the moment that truly laid bare the depth of China's problem. That moment came when Beijing made the decision to test whether the blockade was actually real. The tanker Rich Star approached the enforcement corridor and made its run. Within 20 minutes, it turned back. 2 more tankers followed the same pattern. 3 ships. 3 retreats. And then came the words. Chinese Defense Minister Admiral Dong Jun stepped to a podium and spoke in language carefully designed to project power and resolve. He declared that Chinese ships had passed through Hormuz. He stated that China had standing agreements with Iran. He insisted that the United States had no right to interfere in Chinese commercial affairs. These were strong words, commanding words, words that were immediately broadcast across every single state-controlled media outlet in China and circulated through diplomatic channels around the world. And yet, not a single ship was protected by those words. Not one tanker moved through the corridor that Admiral Dong Jun publicly implied China had both the right and the will to defend. The gap between the official statement and the operational reality on the water was visible, measurable, and undeniable to every navy, every intelligence service, and every government watching this crisis unfold in real time. And that gap, that space between rhetoric and reality, is precisely where the most dangerous calculation of this entire crisis now lives. Let me give you the numbers because the numbers tell the real story. China imports over 10 million barrels of oil every single day, and almost all of it arrives by sea. Roughly 40% of that massive daily supply transits directly through the Strait of Hormuz, and that oil does not come only from Iran. It comes from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Qatar. When you add it all together, approximately half of China's total seaborne oil supply depends entirely on that one narrow waterway remaining open and accessible. As long as the United States Navy controls the strait, China's energy security, the foundation upon which its entire industrial economy is built, sits at the mercy of American decisions. That is not a comfortable position for any nation. But it is an absolutely unacceptable strategic reality for a country that has spent 2 decades telling the world, and telling its own people, that it is a rising global superpower capable of operating independently of American-dominated systems. It is not acceptable for an economy whose industrial base, manufacturing capacity, and political stability all depend on affordable and reliable energy flowing without interruption. And it is certainly not acceptable for a communist party whose entire domestic legitimacy, whose right to rule in the eyes of its own citizens, rests on delivering continuous economic growth to 1.4 billion people who have been promised that their country is ascending to superpower status. This is exactly why the Rich Star's U-turn carries weight far beyond the oil it was carrying. It was the precise moment when China's carefully cultivated claim to peer competitor status with the United States was tested in the real world, on open water, under real conditions, and it came up short. So the critical question becomes, What does Beijing do now? And this is where the crisis enters its most dangerous and most unpredictable phase. Because China does have options. The problem is that none of them are good. Direct military confrontation would mean sending Chinese warships to Hormuz to break the blockade by force. Against what? Against 3 full carrier strike groups anchored by the USS Abraham Lincoln, the USS Gerald R. Ford, and the USS George H.W. Bush. Over 50,000 American military personnel, F-35C and F-A-18 fighters flying constant combat air patrols around the clock, P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft sweeping every inch of the surface, attack submarines operating silently below. The last time the world saw anything resembling this kind of naval standoff was 1962, when Soviet cargo ships approached an American blockade around Cuba. That crisis is remembered as the closest humanity has ever come to nuclear war. China is not in a position to risk that confrontation. Not with Taiwan tensions already running dangerously high. Not with its economy already absorbing severe damage from American tariffs. Not in a theater where American military superiority is overwhelming, unambiguous, and demonstrated daily. Gray zone tactics, the strategy China has mastered in the South China Sea using Coast Guard vessels and fishing militia boats to create presence without triggering open military conflict, simply do not translate to this environment. Those tactics work when you are facing the Philippine Coast Guard or Vietnamese patrol boats. They collapse instantly when you are facing 3 American carrier strike groups. If China sends a gray zone convoy and the United States stops it, Beijing's bluff is called in front of every nation on Earth. Diplomatic and economic pressure through UN Security Council vetoes, selling U.S. Treasury holdings, and weaponizing supply chains operates on timelines measured in months and years. Chinese refineries are operating on timelines measured in days and weeks. The veto does not put oil in a tanker. What Beijing is actually doing right now is the 4th option. Waiting. Calculating. Absorbing damage while attempting to ensure that its rivals absorb even more. China has already halted gasoline and diesel exports, deliberately squeezing Japan and South Korea. It has begun purchasing American liquefied natural gas, reopening imports it had suspended during the trade war, attempting to create diplomatic leverage through economic engagement even as the military confrontation intensifies. It is positioning itself as the indispensable supplier of fuel to Southeast Asian nations, scrambling for alternatives. Hurting, yes, but strategically ensuring its neighbors hurt worse. Now turn to Iran, because Tehran's transformation in this crisis has been nothing short of total. For decades, Iranian military doctrine rested on one single strategic pillar. The ability to close the Strait of Hormuz made Iran untouchable. That threat deterred military action for years. Since Operation Epic Fury began, that leverage was systematically and brutally stripped away. Over 100 coalition aircraft entered Iranian airspace, struck targets in central Tehran, and returned without a single loss. Underground nuclear facilities described for years as impenetrable were penetrated by B-2 bombers carrying bunker-busting munitions. The Bushehr naval base was leveled. The IRGC command chain was shattered. Intelligence chiefs and operations commanders were killed. Iran did close Hormuz. It sent oil prices surging past $150 a barrel. It triggered fuel crises across Europe. It created genuine economic pain across Asia. It proved its ultimate deterrent was real. And then America answered. Not by simply reopening the strait and restoring the old status quo. America took the strait away from Iran entirely, cleared the mines systematically, established a safe navigation corridor, opened it to world trade, and simultaneously locked every single Iranian port behind a blockade that stops the oil from leaving while letting everything else flow. The strait is open for the entire world except Iran. Iran's own weapon turned against it with devastating surgical precision. Hormuz was Iran's sword. America turned it into Iran's cage. 3 possible futures are now in play. Diplomacy, where Iran returns to negotiations. China quietly pressures Tehran as its own energy security deteriorates by the day, a framework is signed, and the strait returns to normal under international oversight. This is the future Washington is engineering with every day the blockade holds. Escalation, where Iran activates the Houthis, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait is disrupted simultaneously. A Chinese convoy creates an uncontrolled confrontation. Oil prices trigger a global recession, and the conflict expands beyond every boundary anyone intended. This is the future nobody wants, but becomes more likely with every day the diplomatic window narrows. Or prolonged standoff, where the blockade holds but does not force resolution. American logistics strain under the weight of sustaining 3 carrier groups indefinitely. China continues probing with sanctioned tankers maintaining a trickle of Iranian oil, and the crisis grinds forward without resolution, inflicting escalating economic pain on every party involved while permanently restructuring global energy markets. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 lasted 13 days. It ended because someone in Moscow looked at the American blockade line, looked at the military reality waiting beyond it, and made the cold calculation that pushing through would cost more than anything that could possibly be gained. In 2026, the same fundamental equation is playing out in a different strait with different actors, different weapons, and far more complex economics. But the core logic remains identical. Military power draws a line. Diplomatic channels offer the only path to resolution that does not end in catastrophe. China's tankers turned back. China's defense minister issued powerful words that could not protect a single vessel. Beijing calculates, but does not act. And that deliberate, careful, measured choice to hold back from the line may be the single most important variable in determining whether this crisis finds an exit ramp or becomes something the world simply cannot contain. The distance between words and action defines the real balance of power in the 21st century. And in the Strait of Hormuz right now, that distance is being measured in real time. One tanker at a time. One enforcement decision at a time. One day at a time. As the oil storage clock counts down toward a moment that changes everything. Hormuz is no longer Iran's weapon. Hormuz is now Iran's cage. And the entire world is holding its breath to see who blinks first.